Good afternoon, everyone. It is 4 p.m. and welcome to the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will be focusing on a new book by Harvard University historian Fredrik Logevall entitled JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917-1956, published by Random House just 1 week ago. Joining us this afternoon will be Barbara A. Perry, the Gerard Bayless Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. She will be serving as a discussant and will be in conversation with Professor Logevall. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chairing this seminar today with Christian Osterman. The seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. Behind the scenes are two people who make the seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And I'd like to thank two institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest and the George Washington University Department of History, not to mention a number of anonymous individual donors whose ranks we invite you to join. On the logistics front, you should know today's session is being recorded and can be soon found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of this webinar, we ask that those with questions use the raise hand function on Zoom. We will try to call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I turn the screen over to my co-chair, Christian Osterman, who will be moderating today's session. Christian.
Thanks, Eric. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today, two of this country's leading scholars of the presidency. Dr. Fredrik Logevall is the Laurence Belfer Professor of International Affairs at the John F. Kennedy School of Government and Professor of History at Harvard University, a specialist on US foreign relations, history, and modern international history. He has previously been the Enbinder Professor of History at Cornell University, where he also served as Vice Provost and Director of the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies. Professor Logevall is the author and editor of 10 books. His book, Embers of War, The Fall of an Empire and the Making of America's Vietnam, won the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for History and the 2013 Francis Parkman Prize, as well as the American Library in Paris Book Award that same year, as well as the Arthur Ross Book Award from the Council on Foreign Relations. His other works include America's Cold War, The Politics of Insecurity, just published this year. A native of Stockholm, Sweden, Fred holds a PhD in history from Yale University. He's a past president of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. And of course, today he will speak, as was just announced, on his just published book, JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956. Fred will be joined and be in conversation with Dr. Barbara Perry, the Gerard Bayless Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, where she co-directs the Presidential Oral History Program. She has authored or edited 14 books on presidents, first ladies, the Kennedy family, the Supreme Court, and civil rights and civil liberties. Her books include 42, Inside the Presidency of Bill Clinton, Rose Kennedy, The Life and Times of a Political Matriarch, Jacqueline Kennedy, First Lady of the New Frontier, and Edward Kennedy, An Oral History. Professor Perry has conducted more than 100 interviews for the George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama Presidential Oral History Projects, and she directs the Edward Kennedy Oral History Project. Prior to her appointment at UVA, Professor Perry was the Carter Glass Professor of Government and founding director of the Center of Civic Renewal at Sweetbriar College in Virginia. She served as a senior fellow for civics education at the University of Louisville's McConnell Center, where she remains affiliated as a non-resident fellow. She also served on the as a US Supreme Court fellow and has worked for both Republican and Democratic members of the Senate. In 1994-95, she received the Justice Tom Clark Award as the Outstanding Supreme Court Fellow of that year. And in 2012, she received the Virginia Social Science Association's Scholar Award in Political Science. a native of Louisville, Kentucky. Professor Perry earned her PhD in government from the University of Virginia and is a frequent media commentator for national and international news sources. As you've just heard, and those of you who view us or join us on a regular basis know Eric and I like to change the format of these sessions every now and then. So today's seminar will begin with a conversation between Professor Perry and Professor Logevall, after each had a chance to make a few introductory remarks. Eric and I may chime in as well, and then we will open the Zoom room to our viewers' questions and comments. As Eric mentioned, to pose a question, please use the hand raised function in the Zoom functionality, and we will call on you in order. My apologies ahead of time to those viewers and listeners we cannot call on due to time constraints. We will conclude right around 5:30. And now, Fred, the Zoom room is yours.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank you, Christian, and Eric in particular for giving us this chance. Barbara for agreeing to come on. I'm thrilled to have this chance to talk about this book. And I just want to say a few things because we are going to turn to a conversation here pretty quickly. You know, I come at this project as a historian. It's a biography, of course, of our 35th president, but I'm a historian. It's what I know, it's my training, it's what my previous work has been about. And so the question for me was, can I write a biography? How can I best write it of this, I think, extraordinary American life? I think it is one of the great stories, the story of John F. Kennedy and of the Kennedys. But how can I do it and bring that historian training to bear? That was a question for me. And when I first batted around ideas for books with my editor, and I tossed out the possibility to him of a kind of life and times biography of JFK. And we got to talking about it, and then we decided it had merit. That was always the question for me. Can I somehow combine this historian's perspective with the biographers? And that's what I've tried to do. And there seemed to me to be an opportunity, there seemed to me to be a kind of paradox in the literature, which is we have endless books on the Kennedys, endless books on particular aspects, I should say, of in this case, JFK's life. Policy decisions while he's president. We have lots of books, for example, on the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have a whole cottage industry on the assassination and the aftermath of the assassination, books on the nature of the marriage and so forth. But what we don't have, this was the kind of puzzle for me, what we don't have is a lot of biographies, full-scale biographies that make use of the incredible resources, for example, at the Kennedy Library in Boston. And maybe in particular, I thought, look at the early years, because if JFK is like the rest of us, and in this respect, I suspect he is, his teens and his 20s are absolutely critical in making him the person that he is. We sometimes forget, I think that, you know, presidents are formed substantially long before they enter the White House. And so I thought, here's an opportunity to look closely at the early phase of Kennedy's life. And the particular thing that I try to do in the book, I'd be so keen to hear what people have to say about this, is I try, goes back to this point about history and biography. I try to tell twin narratives in the book. So it is a book, it is a biography, it is about the rise of John F. Kennedy, but it's also about the rise of the United States to great power status and then to superpower status. And so it's an attempt in a way to do both. And I realized as I was gathering, you know, as we do as historians and as biographers, you gather all your materials together, then you begin to think about themes and you begin to think about how you're going to organize this thing. I thought there could be a double payoff. First, there's the obvious payoff, which is that we have to remember that Kennedy, like anybody else, is the product of his time and place. And so it's critical for me as a biographer to contextualize. So that's one payoff, if you will. But then it occurred to me that you could actually get through the lens of John F. Kennedy, you can actually come to understand the era better. that a lot of the things that we think about in the middle decades of the 20th century, especially in terms of political history and diplomatic international history, are in an important way, I think, bound up with the Kennedys, or at least connected to the Kennedys. If we think about isolationists, so-called isolationists versus internationalists, for example, prior to Pearl Harbor. If we think about the tumult of World War II, through which the United States becomes this colossal world power. If we think about the origins of the Cold War, if we think about McCarthyism, Kennedys are very closely connected to McCarthy, as I describe in the book at some length. If they're connected to that, consider the domestic politics of anti-communism. Kennedy was very shrewd, I think, at playing that game. That's something we can discuss. Each of these developments, this is the conceit of the book, is better understood through John F. Kennedy. And I think the same will hold true, by the way, for the topics that I will examine in volume 2, which is the volume still to come. This is going to be a 2-volume work. So here we think about, in volume 2, civil rights. We think about the space race. We think about Vietnam, something I've written about before. We think about the prospect of nuclear Armageddon, exemplified, I suppose, most notably in the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. Here again, my hope is that I can not only tell the story of JFK from his birth, 1917, at the dawn, I argue, of the American century, to the end in 1963, but in that half century also explain the American story. That's the hope. Now, one last thing maybe that I'll talk about briefly, and then turn this over to Barbara. There are lots of themes in the book that I lay out in the preface. I just want to talk about one thing here. I try, or maybe that's 2 quick things. The first thing is that I'm trying here, I hope with success, I'm trying to look at Kennedy straight in the eye. Not up in veneration, not down in condescension. And that's tricky. Biographers often become too attached to their subjects. And so you will have to judge, if you read the book, whether I've succeeded in that regard. But that's certainly my aim. And he's a flawed individual in important ways. He has missteps as well as successes while president. But the thing that I think maybe in this presidential election year that I just want to articulate in a minute or two, that I think is, for me, a very appealing part of his persona, is that John F. Kennedy believed in politics, believed in government, believed in its role in creating a better America. It was not, I don't think, Kennedy's view that government can solve all our problems. Far from it. He was not an ideological person in many respects. That's something we can discuss if you want to. But I think it's striking that on the stump in 1946, his very first campaign, skinny, emaciated 29-year-old, just back from the service, I think he sounded tones that are especially resonant today in 2020 as we face this election. For example, he said, beware lazy cynicism about politics and politicians. Because he believed, and he said this on the stump that year, in the campaign that year, that the survival of democracy ultimately depends on having an informed and active citizenry, committed to reasoned discourse, it's important, accepting good faith bargaining between the parties. And I think Kennedy, as I put it in the preface, I think he employed the language of empathy, which I think is really important. He emphasized in that campaign, as this neophyte politician, America, and by the way, these are speeches that he wrote himself for the most part in that first campaign. He emphasized Americans' common goals, common fate as a people. Neither then nor later was he above partisan brawling. He could fight with the best of them, don't get me wrong. But I think he did see that compromise is necessary to a functioning democracy. That civility, as he puts it in his inaugural address in 1961, an extraordinary speech. Civility is not a sign of weakness, as he says in that speech. And I think that's important. It helps, civility helps to prevent dehumanization, he suggests, again, already as a beginning politician. Helps us to see our political opponents as adversaries rather than enemies. That's powerful stuff, in my view. And I think it maybe is this. I'll close with this, turn it over to Barbara. I'd be interested to know what others think, but I suspect it is this faith in democracy, though it's tough to make democracy work, he also says. Faith in democracy, faith in his country, that accounts as much as anything for Kennedy's legacy. We can talk about, oh, it's the glamour of the White House, it's Camelot, it's the beauty of the family and of Jackie, or we can say it's the fact that he was assassinated and it lives forever in our minds in this endless loop, which is the Zapruder film. We can talk about those things as being key to his legacy, and they're important, but I think it's more what he, for all of his flaws, which I talk about, what he inspired, the idealism that it seems to me is at the root of this. And then in the inaugural address, all of us can make a difference. That's a theme of that address, 1,355 words. It's short, but powerful. Just a few observations to start us off. Barbara, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Fred. What a superb summary. Just want to thank, first of all, Christian and Eric and Rachel and Peter and all those behind the scenes for putting together this marvelous seminar. And I'm greatly honored to be part of it with the National History Center and the Wilson Center. It's my debut with them, and I hope there'll be many more opportunities for collaboration. I first got to know Fred, but not because I'm actually not a historian and I am not an expert on foreign policy, but I got to know him through my colleague Mark Silverstone at the Miller Center, who is both of those things, and invited Fred to speak several years ago at the Miller Center about his book on Vietnam, his prize-winning book on Vietnam. So that was my introduction to Fred. And then we found ourselves on a panel, a wonderful panel, I guess that was about 1.5 years ago, at the John F. Kennedy National Historic Site, which is the president's birthplace. Many of you might have been there before in Brookline, and it was for the president's birthday, and Fred and David Nassau and I served on a panel. And it was so heartwarming because they do an essay contest for local school children every year for the president's birthday. So here were about 100 third graders, I think they were, out in the audience, just so bright-eyed and learning for the first time probably about President. We could point up to the room where he was born, and I think it really brought it home to them. So with that, I then reached out to Fred to invite him to be a part of our advisory panel and board at the Miller Center for our Obama Oral History Project. He very generously offered his services and his insights, and we're already benefiting from those. So I've been looking forward to this book now ever since I heard about it. And it does not disappoint, I will tell you, it does not disappoint. It is a superb compendium and analysis of John Kennedy's pre-presidential life. But I'm sure that some of you might have had the same question I had, which is really another biography of President Kennedy. You know, what else is there to tell? Well, there's a lot to tell, but Fred mentioned the endless book, so I thought I would look up the statistics. And just by comparison, and I cannot vouch, even though I'm a political scientist, I cannot vouch for this data, but on a quick look, I discovered that supposedly there have been over 16,000 biographies of Abraham Lincoln. Books on George Washington, not just biographies, but books, I found that supposedly over 900. And it says in the data that books on John F. Kennedy now number over 40,000. So since Robert Dalek's 2003 one-volume biography on JFK, which was entitled An Unfinished Life, the reason Fred has so much more to tell, and I'll take you through some of these elements. One is so much more material, so many more archives have been released in that time period since the early 2000s when Robert Dalek was writing. Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s papers have been released by the library. Rose Kennedy's papers have been released. There have been oral histories that I, in doing my research, would go to the library and say, I see this part of Eunice Kennedy Shriver's is still redacted. She's passed on. I don't know whether this was in her deed of gift that there should be a redaction. or the library itself decided, but would you consider unredacting it? And they did. So there are those things. And then I know coming up for Fred's volume 2, he has said that there are many more documents that have been released, I'm sure in the foreign policy realm, intelligence documents that have been released in the meantime. And so I'm sure he will be drawing on that. So the first thing to keep in mind is there's more new material since the last so-called definitive biography was written. Now, for those of you out there who are scholars and who want to place Fred's new book, as well as his Pulitzer Prize winning volume on Vietnam Embers of War, in the Kennedy historiography, let me refer you to my colleague Mark Silverstone's edited volume called A Companion to John F. Kennedy. These are chapters on every single topic you can think about related to John F. Kennedy's life, issues, and events. And each chapter is by a historian who takes you through the historiographic arc of the literature on that particular topic. And so I would make the case that this is the arc that tends to flow through all of those chapters, and we can place Fred's book very clearly into that arc. So the first starts after the president's death with the memoirs of, I call them the Knights of the Round Table of Camelot. So those who worked with President Kennedy, and some of those were rather hagiographic. Not many of the books were quite good, Pulitzer Prize winners, in fact. But let's face it, they were glowing in the afterglow of Camelot and still so sad about the president's premature death after only just a few more than 1,000 days in office. And then inevitably you got the revisionists coming along, both in history and journalism and political scientists, even using the title, The Dark Side of Camelot. So you got that other extreme, it seems to me. But where Fred's book, thank goodness, his books fall into place are these very balanced approaches and very carefully nuanced, balanced approaches to studying President Kennedy, his life and his history. And so Fred certainly does fall into that category. So if you are like me and you are an avid consumer of all things Kennedy, whether that be new books, movies, documentaries, you will, let me just explain the personal side of this, because it really does relate to what Fred was saying at the end of his comments about why Kennedy still has this hold on the American people. And the data does show that. 10 years ago, for example, the Gallup poll asked Americans of the previous 9 presidents, could they rate them in terms of approval or disapproval? President Kennedy came out on top of the last 9 to 10 presidents with about an 89% approval rating. Most recently, people were asked, Americans were polled and asked to vote for the greatest presidents, and typically Lincoln, Washington, first and second. President Kennedy came in third. So what is this hold? So the reason this is personal to me, and as I'm reading Fred's book, it really hits me in the heart, and it's because of this. When I was 4 going on 5, my mother took me to see John F. Kennedy, Senator of the United States, 1 month before he was elected. My mother was not an academic or a scholar. She was a very bright woman, but she was not a historian or a political scientist or a Politico. She was a good citizen, and she read the papers, and she loved politics. And she was a housewife. She was a suburban housewife, and she packed me in the car with my 2 older brothers, drove to downtown Louisville, Kentucky from the suburbs, where she didn't particularly like to drive that much. But to the day she passed, she'd say, remember, we got there extra early so you could stand right in front of the podium and see him. And I've always asked this question, and Fred's book answers it definitively for me. What was it about this man that drew my mother to want to see him and to want him to gaze upon her children? And I know basic answers are he was of her generation, World War II generation, a veteran of the war, as was my dad. He was Catholic, we're Catholic. But when he died, it was as if a member of our family died. And so Fred's book helps you to understand the power of this man for some of the reasons Fred's already suggested, and many more detail that I know you will enjoy reading about. So there's very little that I haven't read about or commented on about the Kennedys. And so at first I was a little bit skeptical. What could there be that's new here? So in addition to Fred using and delving into all this new material, it seems to me that the main contribution is, even if you are, as I am, very familiar with the material, no one has taken a deeper or more detailed or more thoroughly nuanced approach to this material and to John F. Kennedy's life. For example, Fred's meticulous analysis of young John Kennedy's copious letters to his family and to his friends. And then Fred's very keen professorial eye as Fred rereads young John Kennedy's prep school essays and his college essays at Harvard and his senior thesis. All of this Fred then combines with, as Kennedy moves on into the war, before the war, his travels in Europe, particularly in England, France, Italy, and Germany, where he's keeping diary entries. After the war, he's writing journalistic pieces for the Hearst newspapers. Fred goes through all of this material, and then he weaves together the formation of JFK's character, his intellect, his powers of observation, and his, as the Germans would say, his Weltanschauung, using these threads of archival sources. And that produces a very rich tapestry, it seems to me. Now, I wouldn't say that a collegiate Jack Kennedy, as he's traveling around Europe, is exactly Alexis de Tocqueville. And Fred doesn't make the case that he is. But Fred discovers in this material that Jack Kennedy's writing, in his observations all through his life, the bases for Jack Kennedy's crucial diversion from his father's personality, his worldview, and his father's policy positions. And this diversion is crucial to Jack Kennedy's successful political career. So finally, for these few comments I was told to make at the beginning before Fred and I chat a little bit and before we turn to your audience questions, I think just to come back to Fred's points in his opening statement, was that this overarching addition to the Kennedy literature that Fred is offering us with this first volume, and I know will continue in the second volume, is bringing this discerning eye of a foreign policy, foreign relations historian to the enterprise. And I've always been intrigued by life and times approaches to writing biography. It's always been very interesting to me, and I think it's most fruitful when the subject of the biography and when that subject's life corresponds most directly with clear demarcations in history, as John Kennedy's does, and as Fred has explained already today. And that then the biographer comprehends that time frame so thoroughly as Fred does, and then ties into that time frame the subject about whom he is writing. So to start then, Fred, with our conversation, I wanted to ask you, if when you were using this framework of taking your vast understanding and profound understanding of foreign policy, foreign relations history, and applying it to Kennedy, seeing how he was shaped by the American century, and in turn, how eventually he would come to shape it, did you ever have a sense that you needed to go beyond that? Did you run down the hallway to talk to an American historian or a political scientist of the presidency or a psychology professor, that you wanted to go beyond that framework because there were certain parts of Kennedy's life that you wanted to explain perhaps beyond that framework? So with that, I open up to Fred.
That's a really interesting question. I don't know that I did that per se, Barbara. I'm of course always consulting both the existing secondary literature, not just on this president, but on the subjects that relate to this topic. So the bibliography at the end of this first volume is a pretty lengthy one, and it only, by the way, it only lists books. So articles are just in the notes. So I certainly did that, and you know, I think it was George Packer who said that. Only in fiction can we ever truly get to know another person. And I think George is onto something when he says this, because there are certainly parts of this, maybe every biographer finds the same. I certainly did. There are parts of JFK, though I hope we get to know him in this book.
Yes.
There are parts of him that I wanted to know more about. And perhaps speaking to a psychologist, or even somebody trained in psychohistory, which I'm not, might have been fruitful for me. I'm trying, and this will be important in volume 2, maybe even more so than in volume 1, to understand the womanizing. I've said in a couple of interviews that if I'm going to make the argument as I do, that John F. Kennedy was his own man when it came to politics and when it came to deciding on a career, when it came to deciding on a philosophy during World War II in terms of foreign policy. If I'm going to argue that he was his own man there and not under his father's control in the way that Joe Jr., his older brother, always was, very interesting difference between the two brothers. But if I'm going to make that argument with respect to politics and worldview, then I've got to be also able to make that argument with respect to the way he viewed women and treated women, because he was very much his father's son. And his father brought women, mistresses home to the house, which is just mind-blowing. This was very confusing, I think, to the older children in particular. But I guess my point is, if Jack could break free from his father on other stuff, he should have been able to do it here. It's just one example, Barbara, of something that where I would like to know more, and I will try with volume 2 to understand better where this compulsive womanizing comes from. Right. One example.
Well, I think that's very fair. And something else that I appreciated, Fred, is that you, because you are a superb historian, you don't ever take the evidence beyond where it should take you, or if there's no evidence there. So fairly frequently you'll have a paragraph that begins with, we don't know what Kennedy was thinking at this time, or we don't know what he said to so-and-so. And then you will take all of the secondary materials and all of the archival materials, and you'll pull those together to say, here's what I think we can say. And so I did appreciate that.
Oh, I appreciate you saying it. I do think, and I say this to my students, I think we have to rely as historians on conjecture. We have to, at least to some degree, as long as we're careful about it, go on the basis of inference. And I do that. But yes, you're quite right. There are times when I basically feel like I need to tell the reader, here's what I think, here's what I suspect. Kennedy must have felt so-and-so, and I think that's reasonable. But yeah, I try to stop short of not taking the evidence. I don't want to take the evidence beyond where it wants to go.
Right, but it's the most complete analysis that I've ever seen, where you take all of the new materials that are out, comb through those with a fine-tooth comb, and then take that secondary material and we'll say, some at the time said this, or some historians have said this, or some observers have commented on this. But then I think you come to these very fair assessments, and my sense is that they are very accurate. I wonder if we could back up to young Jack Kennedy's early life. And part of the womanizing business, people always point to his ability to compartmentalize. And apparently his father had some of that as well. Where do you think that comes from his earliest years as a little boy, and then going through prep school and on into college and perhaps the war years? Where does that ability, which seems, I think, a fair analysis to say he compartmentalized so many parts of his life, where did he get that, and what did that allow him to do?
I think I don't know whether you would agree, Barbara, you've done research on these years yourself. I think it comes in part from his parents. So I think that Rose, and here I defer obviously to you on questions pertaining to Rose, but my sense is that she too was able to compartmentalize in her life and had, she would go golfing by herself, and she took trips by herself. And so, this is not just Joe Sr., but both of them who did this. And so I'm guessing, I think Jack came by it that way. And then I think his health travails, the problems that he had in being bedridden for a good chunk of his youth, probably also contributed to this desire to sort of bracket that part of himself, and then try to be the picture of energy, the font of vitality in other areas, for example. I also wonder, and I speculate a bit about this in one of the early chapters in his Harvard years, that the fact that he was an Irish Catholic in what was still a kind of waspy bastion, my particular employer at the moment, this particular university, I wonder if it didn't cause him to have a certain detachment here too, in a sense, to compartmentalize, to be both of this place and not. He wanted very much to be a member of a final club, and he was punched, as they say, for one. He got into one. But there was always a sense that he was a certain kind of outsider at the same time. And even, I suggest, in his own family, he was in some ways a bit of an outsider. He was somebody who both was part of it and yet could stand back on some level and observe it, which I find really interesting. I don't know if that begins at an answer to that question.
It absolutely does. And I was also pleased, having written about Rose, his mother, and I think so many people overlook her contribution. And I
Yes.
tried so hard in my book not to overstate her influence. But I think just on the base, and you point this out, his basic personality is actually much more like his mother.
Yes.
I think to the best, to the best than like his dad and like his brother, Joe Jr., in that she could be out on the stump and be gregarious when she needed to be, but she could also be self-contained and be alone and be traveling by herself and sit quietly and read a book. And I think she passed all of that on to him. You mentioned his Catholicism. Oh, sorry, were you going to say
No,
something?
just before we should turn to that in a second, but I just want to affirm what you're saying, that she has not, I think you in particular have helped give her some of the attention that I think she is due. I have great admiration for Nigel Hamilton's, what turned out to be his only volume. He was going to write a 3-volume biography.
That's right.
But I think Nigel and I disagree in a friendly way in this regard. And I think what doesn't come through fully there is, I think, what is her signature importance to Jack. One of my themes in the book, as you know, is what I call his international sensibility. That he was interested in the world, saw a complex and crowded world, whereas I think both his father and his older brother saw a much more narrow, parochial world. I think he gets that in substantial part from his mother, who shared that interest, had that interest in history that she then helped to impart to him. But so I just wanted to affirm you on that, but I interrupted.
No. And I can't remember if we talked about this in Brookline, but my next book is on the political relationship between John Kennedy and Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes,
And
right.
So in reading your book and being reminded about, in some ways, the very parochial life that was forced upon Rose Kennedy, that she fought against and tried to get out and travel. But when it came time to go to college, she was so excited to go to Wellesley, and then her dad forbid her. And she said that was one of the deepest regrets of her life. And I found a letter she had written to a friend where she was saying, can't wait till next year when I go to Wellesley. And instead she gets sent to a convent, a Dutch convent, a strict convent. If she had had the kind of opportunity Eleanor Roosevelt did, both Victorian women of that Victorian age, where at least Eleanor Roosevelt got to go to Mademoiselle Souvestre's, Allenswood in London and have her mind open. What a difference that would have made for Rose Kennedy, and he could have given even more to Jack, it seems to me, in terms of her intellectual background.
Completely could have, and as you alluded to a moment ago, she was a phenomenal campaigner. She had grown up watching her dad, Honey Fitz, and had contributed to his campaigns.
Yes.
But she blew people's minds when in 46 for that congressional campaign, then in 52 for the first Senate campaign, and then in 60 for the presidential campaign. When she spoke on her son's behalf, she was formidable.
She was. Fred, could you talk a little bit, you mentioned just briefly before about his Catholicism and the impact that it did or didn't have on his life. And one thing that I had to make a note of for myself, because it's one of my favorite Christmas movies that I used to watch with my parents, The Bells of St. Mary's, the Bing Crosby, Ingrid Bergman movie. I found that really odd in a way that you discovered that was one of Jack's favorite movies post-war in 1946, I think it was, because it's a very sentimental portrait. Bing Crosby as Father O'Malley, you can't get any more the sentimental view of the Catholic priest, the parish, than that. And so I wondered, either from that or other things that you had studied about Jack Kennedy and about the impact of religion, particularly since that's obviously going to be so important as he's in the 50s and coming up to the race in 1960.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, for one thing, there is a bit of the stifled romantic in JFK, I think, and we think of him as this kind of cool pragmatist, and I think he was, but you see at various points, including with some of these movies, including his interest in poetry, that there was that side of him that I think we should note, and I talk a little bit about that. I think as far as his faith goes, you know, one of the things that struck me, and I need for volume 2, and if there's anybody on this call who can help me, please let me know offline. But I suggest, and I think it's true, that in the White House, as president, he got on his knees to pray. If not every night, I think Jackie has said that he did it on a regular basis in the White House. That surprised me because I'd thought, this is a guy who wears his faith lightly. I suggest at various points in the book that he asked questions. He started to have questions about the Catholic Church and about his faith. There's a certain crisis, I think, maybe connected to the disastrous lobotomy of Rosemary. Maybe separate from that, partly it could be, and here again I speculate, I suggest that, you know, all of us as we grow older and become adults, we begin to question the things we're taught as children. And so maybe some of this is simply a grown person having some doubts. Faith and doubt go together, I think, in intelligent minds. So it's a long way of saying, Barbara, that I think he's a committed Catholic. I don't think he's a particularly observant one. I don't think his religious faith is as important to him as it is to Robert, to Bobby. It's certainly not as important to him as it is to his mother. Maybe in this regard, he is a little closer to his dad, because I don't think Joe Sr. was, we'll put it this way, Joe Sr. believed in the forgiveness of sins. So, you know, he would stray from the marriage bed continually and remain committed to the church. I guess that's how I would summarize it here briefly. I don't know if it resonates with your own sense.
It does, absolutely. And yet I also think it is connected to his knowing that in order to be elected president, he would have to wear that mantle very lightly. And that it just so happened that Jeffersonian separationism, which I think also it comes from and is helped by Ted Sorensen's Unitarianism. Apparently they said to each other, you know, is my Catholicism rubbing off on you, Ted? And he said, no, is my Unitarianism rubbing off on, but the Houston speech in '60 is, you know, brings all of that together. But I can remember my parents, my mother was sort of like Rose Kennedy, you know, very devout. My dad followed all the rules and was, but it's not quite as devout as my mother perhaps. But they would say in our Protestant neighborhood, you know, you don't need to be talking about your religion all the time. And I was actually teased because we didn't eat meat on Fridays, and kids knew I went to Catholic school and they went to public school. But my dad would say, you know, I don't bring up my religion at work. And some of their friends, a good couple that were like surrogate parents to me, the father had been born in Austria and had been born a Catholic and then married a Christian Science believer. And so they became Christian Science. And they told me when I became an adult and visited them, they said, we really appreciated when we would come to your house that we didn't see any Catholic iconography, because that would have made us uncomfortable. So I think there was something about that sort of post-war generation of trying to become urbane and sophisticated and move out of their Catholic, Irish, German ghettos, Italian ghettos sort of thing. Let's move on, Fred. We have just a few more minutes before we're going to open up to the audience. I watched your session that you did for the Kennedy Library last week, and I was anxious to get a little bit more into the PT 109 incident and just generally Jack Kennedy's war experiences, and how it seems to me in the book that's the bridge between his writing as a prep school boy and as a college student, doing his thesis, visiting Europe pre-war, visiting and helping his dad when he was ambassador to the court of St. James's. But that is then that bridge over to his post-war political career as he launches it when he comes back as a veteran. Your thoughts on taking us into our session for comments?
I thank you for that, and it's been great to have this conversation with you and chat about stuff. Yeah, I think that the war years, the war experience in particular, I think it's hard to overstate how important that was. So that's, for those of you who are new to this topic, that's basically the year 1943. It begins earlier to some degree and it continues after, but in terms of when he sees action and is in the South Pacific, it's 1943. And I think, judging by his letters home, which are quite remarkable, secondarily and less important, judging by what some of his mates later say in oral histories, judging by letters that he receives in turn from his family and from his former girlfriend, Inga Arvad, with whom he's still madly in love in 1943, what I think emerges is the picture of somebody who is, and I don't think he's, by the way, alone in what I'm about to say. I think this is common for many fighting men in both Europe and in the Pacific, which is a certain disillusionment. I think he came to see that there was a disconnect between what the brass are saying, between both in tactical terms and strategic terms, what's actually being done. And I think he came to have doubts about the efficacy of military force. And I don't want to make this point too strongly, but what the heck, I'll do it here, that he would have with him right to the end. And that it helps me understand his response at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when I think at various points in the XCOM meetings, he is really, if not the only one, he's certainly the leading proponent of seeking a political solution to this. And I think the prospect of nuclear war is one that he cannot even begin to contemplate. And I think at least some of that goes back to 1943. Final point, I think he also comes out of World War II. And I don't think these are contradictory. Also comes out of World War II, committed to the notion that the United States must play a leading role in world affairs, that it's now going to be the top dog, even vis-a-vis the Soviets. So on the one hand, a disillusionment, I think, with some of what he'd seen in the Pacific and some of the decisions made, and seeing a lot of friends die around him, paired with, and then therefore I think a reluctance later in life when he's president to wield the military weapon, but also a conviction that he and his mates have, because they debate this in his tent, in their tents in the Solomons, that we're going to be the United States in 45, if this ends in 45 or 46 or 47, is going to be a leading world power, and it must be a leading world power. I think he's committed to that. It's one of the reasons why he's I think an original Cold Warrior in a way that his father was not. But I think we probably need to turn things back over to Christian.
Absolutely. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you both for a really thoughtful conversation that I think already has drawn out some of the key points in the biography. Before we open it up to our viewers, let me remind all of them to use the raise hand function to register interest in asking a question. If you could briefly introduce yourself. First, you'll be called on to unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself, and please introduce yourself and keep it brief and succinct, since we have a limited time. Let me perhaps start off, and then I know Eric has a question as well, to go back to Barbara's superb comments, especially about the new sources and the archives. And since the Wilson Center is the home of the Cold War International History Project, and we're sort of documents and archive fetishists, let me perhaps start there and ask a question, Fred, about the sources in two regards. One is, as Barbara mentioned, a lot has already opened up, has opened up in recent years, and Barbara, of course, has been on the forefront of making, of helping that process, and also doing some of the critical histories that accompany the archival sources. But what remains off the table at this stage for those viewers who are not familiar with the intricacies of archival research and the Kennedy Library? What's still out there that we don't have access to? If you could just talk a little bit about that. or what are the sources that you would like to see still that you haven't had access to? And then secondly, connected with that, the question about the Kennedy Library, clearly the key repository for many of these sources underlying the biography. The family has always had a very, very protective hand over the family's legacies and JFK's legacies and legacy. And if you could talk a little bit about navigating an archival repository that's very much still controlled, influenced, shaped by the Kennedy family, and how you've avoided falling into the trap of that. So if you could talk about
sure.
These two questions.
Let me take the second one first. I think things have changed perhaps a little bit, Christian, or at least what I would say to you is that I have not encountered the heavy hand of the Kennedy family in terms of getting access to materials. There are still collections at the library, as Barbara knows, that are under lock and key, that in some cases they just don't have the bandwidth at the moment to do the processing we'd like to see. I would have loved to see, for example, the Torbert MacDonald papers. MacDonald was second only to Lem Billings, I think, in the pantheon of JFK friends, and there are other collections, especially ones obviously now pertaining to Volume 2. So the presidency and the Volume 2 is going to be 57 to 63. So his race for the presidency, which he begins early, key to his success, by the way. And then, of course, it takes us through to the assassination. I really want various collections at the library to be released. But I just want to underscore again, marvelous staff. The archivists there have been so helpful to me, and as I said, I haven't encountered pressure, opposition. I also was determined not to make this any kind of authorized book, so I have not interviewed members of the family. That was a decision, wise or not, that I made early on. Now, with respect to the sources, you, Christian, probably could answer this better than I can, or certainly offer your own answer, and there are probably other people in this session who can speak to this as well. But I think I want to see more of stuff pertaining to Kennedy's presidency, needless to say. And I think it's intelligence sources, and at least some of which I have not been able to see yet, pertaining to various policy issues, foreign policy issues during the administration. There is still stuff on Vietnam, which is maybe the subject I know best, just to give one example. Actually, quite a lot that I would still love to be able to see pertaining to the escalation of the war that occurs under Kennedy in '62, and then to some extent in '63, the thinking with respect to the coup in the summer, late summer and fall of '63, stuff there that I want to see. I should say one final thing. It's possible that, in fact, as we speak, more or less, or over the past few months, or at least until the pandemic hit, stuff had been released that I don't yet know about. I have not really begun, Christian, to get deep into some of the materials pertaining to Volume 2. And it's possible that, in fact, some of the stuff that I think it's not available maybe has been available. That's at least a hope.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Christian. This was an incredibly readable book, and one I think accomplishes your goal of kind of bringing in kind of the broader context of the times, integrating that into the biographical account. The book is very strong on what you just called the internationalist sensibility of the young John F. Kennedy. I want to ask you to go into a bit more detail about the domestic sensibility, to the extent that there is one, in the lead up to his first election in 1946 to Congress. You note at one point in the middle of the book that that Kennedy generally, you say, aligned with the Truman administration and liberal Northern Democrats. He opposed a tax bill favoring the rich and lowering the appropriation for school lunches. He voted against a weakening of rent control and tax relief for the oil industry. He backed more robust Social Security and stepped up minimum wage provisions. And he had a generally favorable voting record with regard to labor rights. What I don't fully get is where his domestic democratic sensibilities come from. You draw extensively on diaries and letters and conversations that he had, particularly with regard to international affairs, since he travels so extensively, given his father's position and his family's wealth. But when it comes to his constituents, his new constituents in the Boston area, and just the gap between his life and theirs, how does he come to liberalism? And how does he come to these positions? Are they deeply felt? He's not part of a larger liberal tradition per se. He comes out of a family and he decides to run for office. So I'm just curious about the domestic vision and the extent to which these values are deeply held at the outset.
That's great. As a quick answer, and then I'll elaborate, I don't think they're particularly deeply felt. I don't think that Franklin Roosevelt, and I say this at some point in passing, but at least as far as I can tell from letters and from other evidence, I don't think Roosevelt, FDR stirred anything deeply in Jack Kennedy. And I don't think the New Deal was something that he grappled with. I think that the debates that took place at Harvard, some of them pretty ferocious debates in the late 1930s, he mostly bypassed, especially when they concerned issues pertaining to domestic legislation. And I think that's pretty telling. And he was not involved with the Harvard Democratic Union or various other organizations that he could have been involved with. I think when he then decides to run in 46, Eric, I think he adopted positions. I think he believed them. I think he wore them fairly lightly. You summarized some of them before. I think that he was kind of in the mainstream of the Democratic Party, both as a candidate in 46 and in the years thereafter. He sometimes voiced suspicion of liberals. And that's in part because I think he was kind of averse, if that's the right word, to ideology, zealotry on both the left and the right. If you read Profiles in Courage, his 1956 book, it's very much what we might call today a sort of centrist manifesto, arguing for the importance of compromise and bargaining with foes. I wrote an op-ed a few days ago in which I looked at Kennedy and his legacy for Joe Biden. And I suggested that, in fact, the two are in some ways kind of similar, apart from the fact that they're both Irish Catholics and the fact that young Joe Biden saw Kennedy as an inspirational figure. There's some of that in him, which I guess is a long-winded way of saying, Eric, that I don't think these are convictions. This is not something he feels particularly passionate about. It's also worth noting that in 47, there are times when he gets along well with Republicans. He's pretty good friends with Richard Nixon in 47 when they debate labor legislation in Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. Kind of hard to distinguish between them. They're sort of on the same page that we don't want the unions to get too powerful, but we also don't want corporate America to run roughshod over workers' rights. This is an example of where he is fairly fluid, I think, both then and in some ways later as well. And of course, he has to, in 56, when he wants to be vice president, he wants to be the nominee next to Adlai Stevenson. This is where I conclude the volume. He's again having to angle, to maneuver and to, on civil rights in particular, tack to the right. He actually has a pretty good record on civil rights in the House and early in the Senate. But he moves to the right. He's able to do that in part because I'm not sure he holds really strong convictions on at least some of these issues.
Thanks very much. Let's open it now two questions from our viewers. Again, please introduce yourself briefly. I'm going to first call on Lynn Rumberg. Lynn Rumberg. Unmute yourself, please. Please unmute yourself. Well, if that doesn't work, I think we'll go to our next viewer and see if we can get Lynn into the conversation a little later. Jason Duncan.
Yes, that works.
We had you for a second, Jason, but then we lost you.
Is that good?
Yep, now I can hear you.
Great. I was going to ask a question. It was sort of the last question I think Eric asked about JFK as a Democrat. You know, he wasn't a populist like Wallace, George Wallace, or Bryan. He wasn't a machine politician like Truman. He wasn't strictly Irish Catholic like Smith. And yet, as you said, Fred, he's not quite an FDR, but maybe he is more like FDR than he wants to admit. Coming from Harvard and money and wealth, taking the religious side out of it. So in the long history of the Democratic Party, where do you think he fits in up to 56? Is he, as you said, is he a moderate Democrat? I mean, that word today has almost no meaning, it seems like. Well, a little bit, Joe Biden, I guess. But is it the Catholic thing that really is important, or is it a mixture of things that shape his view as an identity?
Yeah, I think you've laid it out pretty well, actually. I think that I would say that he's sort of an insider-outsider in the sense that I think he is, in some respects, right in the heart of the Democratic Party. He understands that he's got to appeal to party elders. I think, in fact, on most issues of policy, in domestic terms and in foreign policy terms, I think he is very much in the Democratic Party. I don't buy the argument that's been made by some people that JFK is actually a conservative. I think on fiscal issues and on the early Cold War, where he is, I call him in the book, an original Cold Warrior. I think on those issues, you could say he's really quite to the right. And he certainly has nothing but disdain for Henry Wallace's arguments in favor of a kind of rapprochement with the Soviet Union in 1948, for example. And I talk about that in the book. But, you know, he wants to run to some degree as an outsider. And when Bobby takes charge of the 1952 Senate campaign and won't really play ball with the Massachusetts party, there's a lot of anger on the part of senior officials in the Massachusetts Democratic Party, but they say, no, we're going to run our own campaign. And Bobby says, my allegiance is only to Jack, not to any other sort of organization. So they want to, on one hand, do that. But I think it's to win. It's for tactical purposes, rather than an alienation from the party as a whole. I think he's right in line, for the most part, with right in line in the middle of the Democratic Party in those years, broadly speaking. I'm painting with a broad brush, but that would be my best answer, Jason.
Thank you. Barbara, feel free to chime in as you see fit, and we'll go now to James Banner.
Fred, nice to see you.
Good to see you, Jim. Or at least see your name.
Although I can't see you, but I can see you, you can't see me. In your introductory comments, if I understood you correctly, you attributed a lot of our fascination with Jack Kennedy to the fact that he embraced politics and what politics and leadership through politics could do, and it lingers with all of us. Now, it may very well be that the bloom is off the rose, as we recently saw with young Kennedy being smacked down by Senator Markey. But that aside, when you said, if I'm correct, when I heard you say what you did, I thought immediately of Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Truman in a less spoken way, Ronald Reagan since, Barack Obama in his way. I mean, there have been people throughout the 20th and the early part of the 21st century, just to limit ourselves to that period of time, who have lustily embraced politics, have expressed the value of politics, and for all sorts of reasons, to hammer out differences, to move the country ahead, so forth and so on, lift our hearts through government service and to see what government can do for the general welfare of the United States and its citizens. How does Jack Kennedy may differ in style in that regard, but is he really so singular in our modern history? If we started with the year 1900, is he really different from the others?
He may not be, Jim, and I do think we can see a common thread through the individuals you mentioned. I might quibble with you a little bit about Ronald Reagan in arguing that the government is the problem, not the solution. And again, as I suggested before, I don't think that JFK thought that the government was the solution to all problems, but I think he had a love for politics, and one of the reasons he loved politics was precisely because he thought it was important. It mattered in the daily lives of Americans. I think that's really powerful. And I guess I would also just say this, which maybe does mean that he differs a little bit from this longer history that you've just laid out for us so nicely, is that Americans who have been polled, well, we can actually look at polls during his administration. So this is not simply people responding to the assassination. As I say in the preface to the book, in the summer of 1963, 60% of Americans claimed they had voted for JFK, when only 49.5 or 49.7% had actually done so. So this was a message that I think resonated with people at the time, and this call in the inaugural address: ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I think that was powerful. I think in some ways, whether it differed from what we see with, say, the Roosevelts, as you put it, or later on, let's say LBJ or Reagan, I think people perceived it as being different. And it might have had something to do with his eloquence and the fact that he had really gifted speechwriters, that he himself was really good at. He wasn't good to start with. He became really good at giving speeches. But I think people responded to this in a way that I think is somewhat unique. We hear so often of people who decided to either enter politics in the early 1960s because of this message, or they went into the Peace Corps. They responded in some way to this message. But there you go.
Thanks. I'm going to go to Glenna Matthews next. If Lynn Rumberg is still on the call, do raise your hand again, and I'll put you at the head of the list. So, all right, Glenna.
Yes.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm a scholar primarily of women's history, and so it's not going to be surprising that I want to bring up the issue of JFK's relationship. Well, you might say his gender politics. On the one hand, there's the womanizing. On the other hand, he clearly solicited Eleanor Roosevelt's, goodwill. But more particularly, when I've taught women's history, I've emphasized the importance of the Commission on the Status of Women, which people don't think of JFK as having a distinguished record with women's issues, but in fact, that really was a catalyst. And so I think he's a very paradoxical figure in this respect. And I'm just wondering if Professor Logevall could illuminate this subject.
It's very well put, and Barbara should certainly chime in on this, especially given her new book project. I'll just say here that I think you're right, it is paradoxical, and I think what you see in a few different ways in the administration, and again, I haven't written this part of this is going to be volume 2, but I already know from research that in some respects the administration is really quite progressive, and it's important in terms of its policy decisions, even at least at the middle levels, in having more women in positions of some authority than you would have seen in the past. And so there is this paradox, and I think it's also the case that that first with Inga Arvad, and then with Jackie, even though he didn't treat Jackie well in a lot of respects, he deeply admired these women, and he admired them because of their intelligence and the fact that they could speak foreign languages and he could not, and that they were such incredible sounding boards for him. The relationship, the marriage is something obviously that I deal with in volume 1, that I'm going to deal with more in volume 2. But even there are these paradoxes. But Barbara, could you, since you're working on Eleanor, could
Yes.
thank
you. Yeah, thank you, Fred, and thank you, Glenna, for chiming in. And I hope you'll write to me at BA.Perry at virginia.edu. This will be my last chapter on the Commission on the Status of Women that President Kennedy set up in the end of 1961, and as you say, asked Eleanor Roosevelt to chair. I'm delving into Esther Peterson's oral history at the Kennedy Library. She was a labor lobbyist and apparently made quite an impression on Kennedy, and vice versa, that she began lobbying him in 1948. So I have to get to her papers if I can ever travel again. I need to go to the Schlesinger Library in Cambridge and get to them. But this was leading to my question to Fred about, do you find yourself, when you are bringing your own framework and your own expertise? I studied political science and government from the perspective of presidents and the Supreme Court and constitutional law. And because my avocation of being interested in the Kennedys drew me to a vocation of studying them and writing on them, I find myself, Glenna, having to turn to, and happily turning to, experts like yourself in women's history. So I would really like to keep up with you. But I'm fascinated by the word paradox. And I wonder, another P word would be pragmatism, that Kennedy knew to keep Eleanor Roosevelt on board. And he couldn't have known she was going to pass away in November of 1962. And so I think they had developed their rapprochement at Hyde Park at Valkill in August of 1960, so that she would come on board and go out and campaign for him and cut commercials, television commercials for him, and really go all in for him. But he would have wanted her on board for 1964. So I think it's also something that he could do to keep her on board, to put her at the head of this commission. But I'm really finding that Esther Peterson did so much of the behind the scenes work on putting together the commission, getting the Equal Pay Act written and passed in 1963 before the president's death. So I'll obviously be delving more into that, but I do think it was part and parcel of his pragmatism that he wanted to reach out not only to her, but to keep women on board. And as you say, it really is a kickoff of the 1960s, 70s women's movement, that as I understand it, every state after that developed a women's commission with the national commission that President Kennedy put together with these women leaders from the beginning. Also, Arthur Goldberg, the Secretary of Labor, then went on to the court, but he was also very, very supportive.
One of the things I hope that your book can help me better understand, Barbara, is I don't understand at the 1956 Democratic Convention, when the two of them meet, that is to say JFK and Eleanor Roosevelt, and she basically says to him, why were you not tougher on McCarthy? Why were you so weak on McCarthy? I don't understand, Barbara, why he didn't take the opportunity, which was easy in 1956. McCarthy was a spent force. In fact, he was dying. Why he wouldn't say, yeah, you know what, he's terrible, and I should have voted for censure and he's been a scourge on our politics, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, tell Eleanor Roosevelt the kind of things that she would have maybe wanted to hear. He resists. And part of my explanation, we don't have to get into it here, but I couldn't resist, is that, you know, he's never one to really like attack. He never engages in sort of attack politics. And so it seems unseemly maybe to him to go after McCarthy even now in '56 when it seemed perfectly safe to do so. But anyway.
Right, and all the while she was attacking him and would continue to do so right up until the rapprochement at Belknap in August of 1960, but was writing, you know, in speaking on TV about how his father was buying the election in 1959. He was going to buy the presidency for him. But that's what I spent the first 4 chapters of the book doing, was how did they get to that point? So
we'll read
I'll send that to you and see what you think, and to Glenna as well.
Thank you. David Greenberg.
Did I unmute successfully?
Yes.
Good. David Greenberg from Rutgers. I had the pleasure of reading this book in manuscript and recommend it to all. I also can endorse a wonderful quote from no less than David Kennedy, who said in his review in the Times that the book has, quote, more than enough fornicating and philandering to sate prurient reader's taste. And Fred, I think you should take that, put it in 48-point type and take out an ad somewhere with the quote.
Your question.
So I wanted to ask about this issue of the women. And so much of what has been written on JFK in that vein is so tawdry and unreliable and National Enquirer-esque.
Yeah.
We were talking before about sources.
Yeah.
How do you sort of discern and distinguish in going through the sources about his affairs, the women, what to trust and what not to trust? That seemed to me treacherous ground that you ended up doing, at least in the result, a masterful job with, although I haven't looked at all your sources.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And let me just say here to people that David's input on the draft chapters was just of immense help. And of course, therefore, in the acknowledgements, he gets a big shout out. And it's great to see you here or hear from you here. Yeah, I think it's a problem, David. And I think that it's going to be, I predict a problem, a bigger problem in this volume to come. I think that the material, the evidence that I have available to me with respect to his girlfriends in the first volume, both before his marriage and then in particular with a young Swedish woman, Gunilla von Post, after the marriage. Decent sources, I would say, and I feel fairly confident. I'm careful in the conclusions that I draw or the judgments that I make about these dalliances or these relationships. We have pretty good stuff on Inga Arvad. The fact that she was under FBI surveillance, and I have those transcripts, just extraordinary to hear the FBI eavesdropping on them when they are in hotel rooms and when they are talking about, among other things, whether Jack should run for political office. I think, though, in volume 2, and especially when we get into the White House, this is going to be really difficult, David. This is also, I don't think in volume 1, and here I may be open to criticism from folks, but I don't think there's anything really predatory about, if that's the word, about his womanizing. I suspect that may change as he gets into a position of the ultimate power in human terms. So it'll be a challenge. I hope I've done as good a job as I can here on volume 1.
Thank you. We have a long list of people who would like to ask questions. So if I could ask everyone to be really succinct and short. Andreas Etkes is next.
Okay, I hope it works. I am a scholar at the University of Munich and have also written a German biography of Kennedy and done some exhibits. Just one brief comment and then a question. I think part of the fact that Kennedy was so popular also abroad had to do with the fact that he was just so much younger politician than if you look at the rest of the world. Adenauer in Germany was 40 years his older, Macmillan, Mao, de Gaulle, Khrushchev, all 20 plus years. So there was suddenly someone new and different to many people around the world. And of course he was more popular than many other politicians during his time in office. But I would argue, and so I slightly disagree with some of the points. I'm pretty convinced that his spell would have been broken in a second term. So in a way, his tragic death also led truly to the fact that what could have happened and what actually happened, there's the big thing. And in the tragic sense, his death made Johnson and the reforms possible, something I don't think Kennedy would have been able to achieve or even have wanted to achieve. So to some degree, the question is why are those, of course, you talk about the formative years, but how important are they really for world affairs in the larger sense then?
Thanks.
Oh, okay. Well, so that's a different question than I maybe would have expected. I think that, as I say, I hope, I can only give you what the book attempts to do. And Andreas, if you have a chance to read the book, I'll be interested to see whether you think I make this work. I believe that I show that his experience first in university here on this very campus, and then his experience, especially in the war, were really important in shaping his view of world affairs and what he thought the United States needed to do. And I think that is then reinforced in a way that I hope I lay out in the book when he runs for Congress and enters Congress. Let me just say a couple things. I think you're quite right on your first point about the fact that he was so young. As I said, I'm originally from Sweden. And in Sweden, he was a kind of magnetic figure, not just in death, but in office. And Swedes, my parents tell me, they could not get enough of him. They were so interested in him. And I think it has at least something to do, as you say, with his youth, with the glamour, with those press conferences that at least portions of which were shown even in Sweden. And then I would just say very quickly that I think that we should not underestimate Kennedy's importance. This is where David Greenberg is also really good. Kennedy's importance in getting Johnson's Great Society legislation that we know, that what Kennedy did in bringing a renewed sense of possibility and importance to domestic legislation during his 1,000 days is really important. And I think myself, he actually would have gotten a lot of this passed, even though I also agree with you that in the second term, you would have seen a slackening. One of the reasons why his average approval rating as president is higher than everybody else's is because he only had one term. And so there's no doubt we probably would have seen a kind of slackening in the second term. Much more to be said there, but thank you.
Thank you. We'll go next to James Hirschberg and then Lee White. James Hirschberg, Jim?
Thank you, Christian. I'm a historian at George Washington University, a friend of Fred as well as of Christian and Eric. And like David Greenberg, I was lucky enough to read the book in manuscript, and it is absolutely fantastic, and I cannot recommend it more highly. The question I want to ask concerns JFK's emergence of an independent view from his father about world affairs. And of course, his thesis at Harvard is sort of his declaration of independence about his father's support for appeasement. But one thing that struck me in the manuscript was how much of his teenage years was consumed by bad health, including having to leave Princeton and go to Harvard after having to drop out there. And it really comes through that JFK is a tremendous bookworm. And so I guess my question is, to what extent do you feel that JFK's independent worldview is already coming into play by the time he goes to Harvard? And to what extent does it really emerge in the writing of the thesis?
I think it's really,
or in some other way. So I'll take it from there.
it's really good, Jim. Thank you for that and for your help on all this. I think there's much in what you say, and the fact that as a teenager, as you say, bedridden, he reads so much of Churchill. He's already devouring Churchill's works, including this multi-volume history of World War I. I think he sees already then, I'm not sure I say this in the book or that I can prove it, but that he sees a more complicated world, a more interesting world, a world in which there will be clashing national interests. And he's comfortable with that in a way that I don't think his father ever was. And I think his father was immune to the charms of Winston Churchill, or to the writings of Winston Churchill. And Jack got that. And I think you're right. I don't think it just springs fully formed when he arrives here in Cambridge in Harvard Yard. It is there to some extent when he's growing up, and he's reading so much, and he's drawn in particular to European history, European statecraft, diplomacy. That's the stuff he really wants to read about, and I think it shapes him.
Thank you. So many questions. Let's take a few for sort of final round before we.
Okay, I'll take some notes.
To bring this. Yes, I appreciate that. So let's go first with Lee White, and then we'll do Nathan. We'll go to Nathan Cetino. Lee White, please unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted? Okay.
Yep.
Yes.
This is sort of a non-political question. When JFK was 24, his sister Rosemary was lobotomized. And as you know, she was institutionalized and taken away. In your work and your study, did you find if that had any impact on him later on in life? As we know, when he became president because of Eunice, he was pushed, towards engaging people with disabilities. But did you see if that had any impact on him immediately? Because I know the family basically shuttered her away and disowned her, but did you find anything about any impact it had on him as a person?
Okay, thank you. And next we go to Nathan, and then to Malcolm Odell and David Anderson.
Hi, this is Nathan Cetino. I teach history at Rice University in Houston. Congratulations, Fred.
Good to hear from you. Good to see you, sort of.
Good to see you.
Your name? Yeah.
My question is, in the period examined in your book, what experiences formed JFK's views toward the colonized world, or the third world, that would be so important in his presidency? Thank you.
Thank you. Malcolm Odell next, and then David Anderson, and I'm afraid it's going to have to be it.
Hi there, Malcolm Odell, one of Kennedy's first Peace Corps volunteers, 1962.
Great.
And what I want to know, I've worked overseas ever since, following his charge, of course. But I would like to know, this is going into volume 2 or so, what would you think his view would be, given his worldview, his opposition to his father's views, his love of Churchill, etc.? What would his view towards the present dilemma we're facing about white supremacy, anti-racism, and whether the Peace Corps can be a anti-racist organization, or whether it's a vestige of white supremacy?
Thank you. And finally, David Anderson, and then Fred, you've got the floor.
Hi, Fred. Hi, Fred. I'll be real quick. I'm curious about this idea of charisma. When you think of Kennedy, we think of charisma, and I'm wondering when that is apparent, where it comes from, if it's kind of something he always has, or it's something he acquires as a young politician.
Great questions, guys. So I'll be brief. This is the speed round. Rosemary, I write about this. It's a terrible development in the late fall of 1941. I think initially, Joe Sr. hides even from his own family the extent of the disaster and the degree to which she came out of that procedure much worse than she went in. A question that I was not able to answer ultimately is, when did the rest of the family, including Rose, and maybe Rose knew from the moment it happened, but when did the children, especially in this case the older children, have a real full sense of what had occurred, that when she is sent away to Wisconsin, it wasn't to teach, as was said, but it was because in fact this thing had gone horribly awry. I think over time, and this will be something that I have to deal with more in volume 2, so I don't have a good answer yet, he becomes fully committed, in part because of Eunice, as you pointed out, to putting the federal government and its resources to bear, bringing them to bear on this topic. And I look forward to finding out more. That's all I'll be able to say here, given the shortage of time. Nate, your question is so good about the colonized world. I think one of the things that struck me, and I write about this even in Embers of War, was the degree to which when he goes to Indochina in 1951, and it's part of a longer Far East trip that I talk about in this book, in JFK, a trip with Bobby and with Patricia, he is making really interesting comments that I think are prescient and I think are heartfelt about the importance of decolonization and the importance of the United States being on the right side of history, and how supporting what the French are doing in Indochina, for example, is going to put the US on the wrong side, and that we have to think about this in a new way. And I think there's much more to be said there, but he is an early, it seems to me, astute student of the colonized world. And the Algeria speech in '57, oh, we could talk about that forever. You know, I don't know what to say about, I mean, I'm confident in saying that Jack Kennedy, as is maybe true of literally every president we've had in the modern history of the country, would be deeply distraught by what we're seeing today in our politics and what we're seeing in terms of the tenor of our political discourse, the partisan divisions. I think they would, I have to believe they would all be appalled by this. And I just come back, I'll just say this very quickly. I think the emphasis, you know, JFK said something revealing to a friend of his, David Ormsby Gore. He said, this is in about 1955, so before he becomes president, he says, you know, I'm not sure I'm cut out to be a politician. Why, David said. Well, it's because I always see the merits in the arguments of the other side. And, you know, I can see why I don't have a monopoly on truth. Nobody does. And he wrestles with this. And I think it's not a direct answer to your question. I certainly think that he would be just mortified by claims for white supremacy and so forth. And I don't think he would say that the Peace Corps, though it might have had Cold War motivations in part, is somehow a vestige of this. That's the best I can offer. And finally, David, on charisma, you know, I think you see signs of this early on. I think he's got a highly developed sense of humor. And I think it's evident even in his college years, and even at Choate as a prep school student. He was a guy people like to spend time with, in part because he was funny in a self-deprecating kind of way. And those are always the most nice, the best people to be around if they're funny, is if they are in a self-deprecating way. And it's a pretty short step, I think, from that to some of his charismatic appeal. But he also works hard at this. Let's not forget, people, that this is a guy who works hard on his speeches. He never memorized his speeches, but he practiced them. And he wanted to work in some jokes, and he wanted to work in the pauses, the pregnant pauses that are so important in effective speech making. So some of the charisma is learned, and then some of it is, you know, is inborn. So I think Christian is saying, that's it.
Thank you so much. Over to Eric.
All right, well, thank you, Fred and Barbara, as well as those of you posing questions from the audience, and apologies, of course, to those of you with questions that we couldn't get to. We hope you join us next week on Monday, September 21st, for the next installment of the Washington History Seminar, this one featuring historian Eric White and his recent book, A World Divided, The Global Struggle for Human Rights in the Age of Nation States. Till then, take care and stay safe, and thank you.